1 hour of Vietnam War facts to fall asleep to. Welcome to our channel. Before starting, please like and subscribe for more stories. The Vietnam War, one of the most defining conflicts of the 20th century, did not occur in a vacuum. Its roots lie in Vietnam's long history of colonial subjugation, nationalist movements, and global ideological clashes. To understand how the war unfolded, we must examine the historical background that shaped Vietnam and set the stage for one of the most controversial conflicts in modern history. For centuries, Vietnam had been a contested territory, repeatedly fighting for its independence from foreign powers. In the 19th century, Vietnam fell under French colonial rule as part of French Indochina, which also included Laos and Cambodia. The French sought to exploit Vietnam's natural resources, including rice, rubber, and minerals, while imposing their cultural and political dominance on the local population. This led to widespread resentment among the Vietnamese, who viewed the French as exploitative oppressors. Over time, resistance movements began to emerge, seeking to reclaim Vietnam's sovereignty. The first significant anti-colonial movement came under Phan Boi Chau, who sought to modernize Vietnam and gain independence by aligning with Japan. However, the French suppressed these early efforts. By the early 20th century, a more cohesive and determined movement emerged under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary who would later become the face of Vietnamese independence. Ho Chi Minh embraced communist ideology and was inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. He believed that Marxism-Leninism provided the framework for overthrowing colonial rule and establishing a more equitable society. The outbreak of World War II created an opportunity for Vietnamese nationalists to advance their cause. During the war, Japan occupied Vietnam, effectively displacing French authority. While the Japanese presence was exploitative, it disrupted the established colonial order and gave rise to new resistance movements. Ho Chi Minh formed the Viet Minh, a communist-led nationalist organization that sought to drive out both the Japanese and the French. By 1945, the Viet Minh had gained significant support from the rural population, who were drawn to their promises of land reform and independence. In the aftermath of World War II, Japan's defeat left a power vacuum in Vietnam. The Viet Minh seized this moment, declaring Vietnam's independence on September 2, 1945, with Ho Chi Minh delivering a speech in Hanoi that echoed the U.S. Declaration of Independence. However, this newfound freedom was short-lived. The French, determined to reassert their colonial authority, launched a military campaign to regain control of Vietnam, sparking the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954. The conflict between the French and the Viet Minh was brutal and protracted. France received substantial support from the United States, which saw Vietnam as a crucial battleground in the emerging Cold War. The U.S. feared that a communist victory in Vietnam would set off a chain reaction, leading to the spread of communism across Southeast Asia, a concept later known as the domino theory. Despite this support, the French struggled to suppress the Viet Minh, who employed guerrilla tactics and had the advantage of local knowledge and widespread support among the population. The turning point came in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the Viet Minh, under General Vong Nguyen Giap, defeated French forces in a decisive victory. This battle marked the end of French colonial rule in Vietnam and led to the signing of the Geneva Accords. The accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, creating two separate states: North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and backed by the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States and other Western allies. The division of Vietnam was intended to be temporary, with elections planned for 1956 to reunify the country. However, these elections never took place, as the U.S. feared that Ho Chi Minh's popularity would lead to a communist victory. Instead, the U.S. supported the establishment of a pro-Western government in South Vietnam under Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist. Diem's regime, however, quickly became unpopular due to its authoritarian practices, corruption, and repression of political dissent, particularly against Buddhists and other religious groups. The stage was now set for a broader conflict. In the north, Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party worked to solidify their control, implementing land reforms and building a socialist state. In the south, resistance to Diem's rule grew, culminating in the formation of the National Liberation Front, NLF, or the Viet Cong, which sought to overthrow the South Vietnamese government and reunify the country under communist rule. By the early 1960s, the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was at its height, and Vietnam became a focal point in this global struggle. The U.S. viewed South Vietnam as a bulwark against the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, while the Soviet Union and China provided support to North Vietnam. This ideological clash between capitalism and communism would fuel the Vietnam War, turning it into a proxy conflict with devastating consequences. The historical backdrop of the Vietnam War is crucial for understanding the complexity of the conflict. It was not merely a war between North and South Vietnam, but a convergence of anti-colonial struggles, ideological battles, and global superpower rivalries. The roots of the war were deeply embedded in Vietnam's history of resistance against foreign domination, and its consequences would resonate far beyond the borders of Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War is often seen as a conflict rooted in the Cold War, and the United States' involvement in Vietnam was deeply tied to its global strategy to contain communism. The domino theory, a central tenet of U.S. foreign policy during this era, drove American decision-making and led to its significant involvement in Southeast Asia. Understanding this involvement requires examining the political, ideological, and strategic motivations behind U.S. actions in Vietnam. The domino theory was first articulated by President Dwight D. Eisenhower in the early 1950s, during the height of the Cold War. This theory posited that if one nation in a region fell to communism, neighboring countries would soon follow, like a row of falling dominoes. Southeast Asia, with its strategic location and valuable resources, was viewed as particularly vulnerable to this cascade effect. Vietnam, divided into North and South after the Geneva Accords of 1954, became the primary battleground for this ideological struggle. The U.S. initially supported France during the First Indochina War, providing financial aid and military supplies to combat the communist-led Viet Minh. However, France's defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and its subsequent withdrawal from Vietnam left the U.S. to fill the power vacuum. American policymakers believed that failing to act decisively in Vietnam would embolden communist movements elsewhere, undermining U.S. credibility and threatening its allies in Asia and beyond. With the division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel, the U.S. sought to build a strong, anti-communist state in South Vietnam to counter the communist North led by Ho Chi Minh. This led to the appointment of Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunchly anti-communist Catholic, as the leader of South Vietnam. Diem's regime was heavily supported by the U.S., which provided financial aid, military advisors, and diplomatic backing. Between 1954 and 1960, the U.S. poured over $1 billion into South Vietnam, funding its military and infrastructure to bolster its resistance against communist forces. Diem, however, proved to be a controversial and divisive figure. While he was seen by Washington as a reliable bulwark against communism, his policies alienated large segments of the South Vietnamese population. Diem's government was characterized by authoritarianism, nepotism, and corruption. He repressed political dissent, targeted Buddhist religious leaders, and favored the Catholic minority, exacerbating tensions in the predominantly Buddhist country. These actions fueled discontent and increased support for the National Liberation Front, NLF, or Viet Cong, a communist insurgency that sought to overthrow Diem's regime and reunify Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh's leadership. As opposition to Diem's government grew, the U.S. faced a difficult decision. President John F. Kennedy, who took office in 1961, inherited the escalating crisis in Vietnam. Kennedy subscribed to the domino theory and believed that Vietnam was a critical front in the global fight against communism. To prevent the collapse of South Vietnam, Kennedy increased U.S. involvement, deploying 16,000 military advisors by the end of 1963. These advisors trained South Vietnamese forces, supported counterinsurgency efforts, and participated in joint operations against the Viet Cong. Despite these efforts, the situation in South Vietnam continued to deteriorate. Diem's oppressive policies and inability to address widespread poverty and inequality undermined his government's legitimacy. By 1963, mass protest against Diem's regime, including the iconic self-immolation of Buddhist monk Tet Quang Duc, had captured international attention and highlighted the deep divisions within South Vietnamese society. The U.S., increasingly frustrated with Diem's leadership, tacitly supported a military coup that led to his assassination in November 1963. The overthrow of Diem plunged South Vietnam into political chaos. A series of unstable governments followed, each struggling to combat the growing Viet Cong insurgency. This instability made it increasingly difficult for the U.S. to withdraw, as American policymakers feared that South Vietnam would collapse without their continued support. The situation was further complicated by the North Vietnamese government's active role in supporting the Viet Cong, using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to transport troops, weapons, and supplies into South Vietnam. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy after his assassination, inherited the deepening crisis in Vietnam. Johnson was deeply committed to the domino theory and believed that a U.S. failure in Vietnam would embolden communist movements worldwide. Determined to prevent this, Johnson sought congressional approval to escalate American involvement. The opportunity came in August 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which U.S. naval vessels were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese forces. Although the details of the incident remain controversial, it provided the justification for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which granted Johnson broad authority to use military force in Vietnam. The resolution marked a turning point in U.S. involvement. By 1965, Johnson had ordered the deployment of combat troops to Vietnam, marking the beginning of full-scale U.S. military engagement. This escalation was accompanied by Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign aimed at crippling North Vietnam's infrastructure and breaking its will to fight. The U.S. believed that its overwhelming military superiority would quickly bring the North to the negotiating table. However, this strategy underestimated the resilience and determination of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. The U.S.'s deepening involvement in Vietnam reflected a broader Cold War strategy of containment, but it also exposed the limitations of this approach. The domino theory, while influential, oversimplified the complexities of Vietnamese nationalism and the local dynamics of the conflict. For many Vietnamese, the war was not just an ideological battle between communism and capitalism, but a struggle for independence and self-determination. By the mid-1960s, Vietnam had become a quagmire for the United States. Despite significant military and financial investment, the conflict showed no signs of resolution. The challenges of counterinsurgency warfare, coupled with growing resistance to the war at home, would soon push the U.S. into an even deeper crisis. The foundations of the Vietnam War were laid by a combination of Cold War ideology and local political realities, but as the conflict escalated, it became clear that this was no ordinary war. It was a clash of worldviews, cultures, and historical trajectories that would shape the fate of Vietnam and the United States alike. The Vietnam War escalated dramatically in the mid-1960s, transforming from a conflict largely fought by South Vietnamese forces with U.S. support into a full-scale war involving American combat troops. This escalation was driven by several factors, but a pivotal moment came with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. This event, controversial both at the time and in hindsight, gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the justification to intensify U.S. involvement in Vietnam and marked the beginning of direct military intervention. By the early 1960s, the U.S. had already become deeply entangled in Vietnam. Under President John F. Kennedy, the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam had grown significantly, reaching around 16,000 by the time of his assassination in November 1963. These advisors were tasked with training South Vietnamese forces and supporting counterinsurgency efforts against the Viet Cong, the communist guerrilla fighters operating in South Vietnam. However, despite increased U.S. assistance, the South Vietnamese government remained politically unstable following the assassination of President Ngo Dinh Diem, and the Viet Cong continued to gain ground. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy, was determined to prevent the collapse of South Vietnam. Johnson, like many of his predecessors, subscribed to the domino theory, which held that the fall of Vietnam to communism would trigger the spread of communist regimes throughout Southeast Asia. To Johnson, losing Vietnam was not just a regional issue, but a threat to U.S. credibility and the balance of power during the Cold War. However, to justify significant escalation, Johnson needed a clear reason to rally support from Congress and the American public. The opportunity came in August 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a controversial series of events that occurred off the coast of North Vietnam. On August 2, 1964, The USS Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer conducting intelligence-gathering operations in the Gulf of Tonkin, reported being attacked by 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats. The Maddox fired warning shots, and in the ensuing skirmish, U.S. aircraft were called in, resulting in the sinking of 1 North Vietnamese boat and damage to others. The Maddox emerged from the encounter relatively unscathed, with only a single bullet hole reported. 2 days later, on August 4, 1964, a second attack was reported. The Maddox, along with the USS Turner Joy, another destroyer, claimed to have come under attack from North Vietnamese forces during a nighttime patrol. However, the details of this second incident were murky. Radar and sonar readings suggested the presence of enemy vessels, but no visual confirmation of an attack was ever made. Later investigations revealed that the radar signals were likely false readings caused by weather conditions and overzealous interpretation by the crew. Despite the ambiguity, the Johnson administration seized on the Gulf of Tonkin incident to push for greater military involvement. Johnson addressed the nation, presenting the attacks as unprovoked aggression by North Vietnam and a direct challenge to U.S. resolve. In response, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7, 1964, granting Johnson broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The resolution passed overwhelmingly, with only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution marked a turning point in U.S. involvement in Vietnam. With this broad mandate, Johnson escalated military operations significantly. In early 1965, the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign targeting North Vietnamese infrastructure, supply lines, and military installations. The goal of Rolling Thunder was to weaken North Vietnam's ability to support the Viet Cong insurgency in the south and to pressure its leaders into negotiations. However, the campaign faced significant challenges. North Vietnam's air defenses, including Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles SAMs, inflicted heavy losses on U.S. aircraft, and the bombing raids failed to break the North's resolve. At the same time, Johnson authorized the deployment of the first U.S. combat troops to Vietnam. In March 1965, 3,500 Marines landed at Da Nang, officially marking the beginning of direct American ground involvement in the war. Over the next several years, the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam skyrocketed, reaching over 500,000 by 1968. These troops were tasked with conducting search and destroy missions to root out Viet Cong fighters and disrupt their operations. The U.S. also expanded its presence in South Vietnam, building bases, airfields, and supply depots to support the growing war effort. Despite these efforts, the war proved far more complex and challenging than American leaders had anticipated. North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and General Vong Nguyen Giap, was deeply committed to its goal of reunifying the country under communist rule. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and the Viet Cong were highly adaptable, employing guerrilla tactics that frustrated U.S. forces. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of supply routes running through Laos and Cambodia, allowed the North to sustain its forces in the South despite relentless U.S. bombing campaigns. The escalation of the war also began to take a toll on American society. By 1966, the U.S. public was becoming increasingly aware of the human and financial costs of the conflict. Images of combat, civilian casualties, and burning villages were broadcast into American homes, fueling skepticism about the war's progress and purpose. Johnson's claims of imminent victory were undermined by reports of heavy U.S. casualties and the apparent resilience of the Viet Cong. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, once seen as a clear justification for U.S. involvement, also came under scrutiny. By the late 1960s, evidence emerged that the second attack on the Maddox and Turner Joy may never have occurred. In 1971, the release of the Pentagon Papers, a classified study of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam, revealed that the Johnson administration had exaggerated the events in the Gulf of Tonkin to gain congressional and public support for escalation. This revelation further eroded trust in the government and fueled anti-war sentiment. The escalation of the Vietnam War following the Gulf of Tonkin incident had far-reaching consequences. While it allowed the U.S. to project its power in Southeast Asia, it also plunged the nation into a costly and divisive conflict with no clear end in sight. The events of August 1964, both real and fabricated, served as a catalyst for one of the most controversial chapters in American history, highlighting the dangers of miscalculation and the complexities of waging war in a deeply divided world. The Vietnam War is often remembered for the unconventional and grueling nature of its combat. Central to this was the role of guerrilla warfare as employed by the Viet Cong National Liberation Front, or NLF, and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA. These tactics not only frustrated the far superior military power of the United States but also prolonged the war, turning it into one of the most difficult and costly conflicts in American history. The Viet Cong's ability to adapt, strike unexpectedly, and blend into the civilian population challenged conventional warfare strategies and highlighted the limitations of U.S. military might. The Viet Cong were a South Vietnamese communist guerrilla force supported by North Vietnam. Their origins can be traced back to the First Indochina War against the French, where communist-led forces developed guerrilla tactics to compensate for their lack of heavy weaponry and resources. After the Geneva Accords of 1954 divided Vietnam, the Viet Cong emerged as a key component of the communist strategy to reunify the country under Ho Chi Minh's leadership. Guerrilla warfare, a strategy of survival and resistance. Guerrilla warfare, by its nature, relies on mobility, surprise, and the exploitation of the enemy's weaknesses. For the Viet Cong, this strategy was essential, given the vast technological and material advantages of the U.S. military. The Viet Cong used small, decentralized units to carry out ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run attacks. These operations inflicted heavy casualties on U.S. and South Vietnamese forces while avoiding large-scale, conventional battles where the Viet Cong would be at a disadvantage. One of the most significant challenges for U.S. forces was the Viet Cong's ability to blend into the civilian population. The guerrillas did not wear uniforms, making it nearly impossible to distinguish them from ordinary villagers. This created a constant state of uncertainty for American soldiers, who were often unsure whether the local population was friendly, neutral, or actively aiding the enemy. The Viet Cong's presence in South Vietnam's rural areas was deeply rooted in their relationships with local communities, many of whom supported their cause either out of ideology or fear of reprisal. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, lifeline of the guerrilla war. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a critical element of the Viet Cong's guerrilla operations. This vast network of jungle paths and tunnels stretched from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam, allowing the North to supply the Viet Cong with weapons, ammunition, and reinforcements. The trail was heavily bombed by U.S. forces during the war, but the North Vietnamese continually repaired and expanded it, often using human labor to bypass destroyed sections. The trail's effectiveness highlighted the resilience and ingenuity of the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies. It also demonstrated the interconnected nature of the conflict, as neighboring countries became unwilling participants in the war due to their role as transit routes for supplies. Tunnels, traps, and psychological warfare. The Viet Cong's ingenuity extended to their use of underground tunnels, which provided them with a significant tactical advantage. The Siu Chi tunnels, a network spanning hundreds of miles near Saigon, served as supply routes, living quarters, and command centers. These tunnels allowed the Viet Cong to launch surprise attacks and then disappear before U.S. forces could respond. The tunnels were often booby-trapped and filled with false passages, making them extremely dangerous for U.S. soldiers tasked with clearing them. Booby traps were another hallmark of Viet Cong tactics. These ranged from simple punji sticks, sharpened bamboo stakes placed in concealed pits, to more complex explosive devices. Traps were designed to maim rather than kill, as injured soldiers required greater resources to evacuate and treat, placing additional strain on U.S. forces. The psychological impact of constantly facing unseen threats took a toll on American troops, contributing to low morale and heightened anxiety. The Viet Cong also used psychological warfare to their advantage. They employed propaganda to win the hearts and minds of South Vietnamese villagers, portraying the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces as foreign oppressors. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and village meetings were used to spread their message. In some cases, the Viet Cong coerced villages into supporting their cause, using intimidation and targeted violence against perceived collaborators with the South Vietnamese government. Challenges faced by the U.S. military. For U.S. forces, the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics presented a unique set of challenges. The American military was trained and equipped for conventional warfare, relying on superior firepower, air support, and armored vehicles. However, these advantages were often neutralized in the dense jungles and rural landscapes of Vietnam. The Viet Cong's intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed them to strike and retreat with ease, frustrating U.S. commanders who struggled to pin them down. The U.S. military's response to guerrilla warfare included large-scale operations, such as search-and-destroy missions, aimed at rooting out Viet Cong strongholds. These missions often involved sweeping through villages suspected of harboring guerrillas, destroying homes, and burning crops. While these tactics sometimes disrupted Viet Cong operations, they also alienated the local population, driving more civilians to support the guerrillas. The My Lai massacre in 1968, in which U.S. troops killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, became a symbol of the moral and strategic failures of these tactics. Another challenge was the Viet Cong's use of time as a weapon. The guerrillas understood that they did not need to defeat the U.S. military outright. They only needed to outlast it. By prolonging the conflict and inflicting steady casualties, the Viet Cong eroded American public support for the war. The Tet Offensive in 1968, a massive coordinated attack by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, exemplified this strategy. Although the offensive was a tactical failure for the communists, it shocked the American public and demonstrated the Viet Cong's ability to strike anywhere, including heavily fortified areas. The role of ideology and motivation. One of the Viet Cong's greatest strengths was their ideological commitment. For many fighters, the war was not just a struggle for political control, but a fight for national liberation and independence. This sense of purpose, combined with the belief that they were defending their homeland against foreign invaders, gave the Viet Cong a level of determination and resilience that was difficult for U.S. forces to match. The Viet Cong also benefited from the broader context of the Cold War, as they received significant support from China and the Soviet Union. This support included weapons, training, and logistical aid, enabling the Viet Cong to sustain their operations despite the immense pressure exerted by U.S. forces. The Vietnam War was defined by a series of key battles and campaigns, each illustrating the complexity and brutality of the conflict. Among these, the Tet Offensive of 1968 stands out as a pivotal moment that reshaped perceptions of the war and marked a turning point in both military strategy and public opinion. To understand the significance of the Tet Offensive, we must also examine the broader context of key battles that preceded and followed it, including the challenges faced by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces in their struggle against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army in VA. The Battle of Ia Drang, 1965. The first major battle between U.S. forces and the NVA occurred in Ia Drang Valley in November 1965. This engagement demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of each side. U.S. forces, utilizing helicopters for rapid deployment, inflicted heavy casualties on the NVA, showcasing their superior firepower and mobility. However, the battle also revealed the NVA's resilience and their willingness to suffer immense losses in pursuit of their goals. The NVA adopted close-range tactics to neutralize U.S. air and artillery advantages, a strategy they would employ throughout the war. While the U.S. claimed victory at Ia Drang, a high casualty rate foreshadowed the protracted and costly nature of the conflict. The Tet Offensive, a coordinated assault. By 1968, the Vietnam War had reached a critical juncture. The U.S. had deployed over 500,000 troops, and American leaders, including President Lyndon B. Johnson and General William Westmoreland, had assured the public that victory was within reach. However, the Tet Offensive, launched on January 30, 1968, shattered these optimistic claims and exposed the war's harsh realities. The Tet Offensive was a massive, coordinated attack by the Viet Cong and NVA across more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam, timed to coincide with the Vietnamese Lunar New Year Tet, a traditional holiday. The offensive included strikes on key urban centers such as Hue, Da Nang, and Saigon, as well as attacks on U.S. military bases. One of the most dramatic moments occurred when a Viet Cong commando unit temporarily breached the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon, shocking both the American public and military leadership. The Battle of Hue. One of the most intense and symbolic battles of the Tet Offensive took place in Hue, a historic city in central Vietnam. For nearly a month, U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese forces engaged in fierce urban combat against entrenched NVA and Viet Cong fighters. The battle left much of the city in ruins and resulted in significant civilian casualties, including the Hue Massacre, in which Communist forces executed thousands of suspected collaborators. While U.S. and South Vietnamese forces ultimately recaptured Hue, the high cost in lives and destruction highlighted the brutal nature of the conflict. A tactical defeat, a strategic victory. From a purely military standpoint, the Tet Offensive was a failure for the Viet Cong and NVA. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces repelled the attacks, inflicting heavy casualties on the Communists. The offensive effectively destroyed the Viet Cong's ability to operate as a cohesive force, forcing North Vietnam to assume a greater role in the conflict. However, the Tet Offensive achieved its strategic objectives by undermining American confidence in the war effort. The stark contrast between the administration's optimistic rhetoric and the reality of the offensive eroded public trust and fueled growing anti-war sentiment in the United States. Televised images of the Tet Offensive, including the infamous execution of a Viet Cong prisoner by a South Vietnamese officer, shocked viewers around the world. For many Americans, the offensive symbolized the futility of the war and the immense human suffering it caused. Public opinion began to shift, with increasing calls for de-escalation and withdrawal. President Johnson, deeply affected by the backlash, announced in March 1968 that he would not seek re-election, signaling a turning point in U.S. policy. The Siege of Chi San, 1968. Another major battle during this period was the Siege of Chi San, which began in January 1968, shortly before the Tet Offensive. North Vietnamese forces surrounded the U.S. Marine base at Chi San, launching a prolonged assault that drew comparisons to the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. For 77 days, U.S. forces defended the base, relying heavily on air support to repel the attackers. While the siege ultimately ended in a U.S. victory, it diverted resources and attention away from other areas, allowing the Tet Offensive to unfold with greater impact. Impact of the Tet Offensive on U.S. strategy. The Tet Offensive forced a reassessment of U.S. strategy in Vietnam. General Westmoreland's call for additional troops was met with skepticism, as both political leaders and the public questioned the feasibility of achieving a decisive victory. The U.S. began shifting toward a strategy of Vietnamization, focusing on training and equipping South Vietnamese forces to take over combat responsibilities. This marked the beginning of a gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops, though the war would continue for several more years. Legacy of the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive remains one of the most studied events of the Vietnam War, illustrating the complex interplay between military tactics, psychological warfare, and public perception. While it was a tactical defeat for the Communists, it was a strategic success that changed the trajectory of the war. For the United States, Tet exposed the limitations of military power in resolving ideological and political conflicts, leaving a lasting impact on American foreign policy and military doctrine. The Vietnam War was not only fought on the battlefields of Southeast Asia, but also on the streets, college campuses, and living rooms of the United States. The anti-war movement became one of the most defining and divisive aspects of the Vietnam War era, highlighting the growing disconnect between the U.S. government's policies and the public sentiment. What began as a relatively small protest against military involvement evolved into a nationwide movement that shaped public opinion, influenced political decisions, and left a lasting impact on American society. The roots of the anti-war movement. The seeds of the anti-war movement were sown in the early 1960s, as U.S. involvement in Vietnam began to escalate. Initially, opposition to the war was limited to pacifist organizations, leftist groups, and some intellectuals who criticized U.S. foreign policy as imperialistic. Groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, became prominent voices in the early anti-war movement. The SDS, in particular, gained national attention with its Port Huron Statement in 1962, which called for a more participatory democracy and condemned militarism. As U.S. troop deployments increased in 1965 under President Lyndon B. Johnson, so too did opposition to the war. The war's ambiguous objectives and its portrayal as a conflict to contain communism in a distant land resonated poorly with many Americans, particularly younger generations. By the mid-1960s, the anti-war movement began to gain momentum, fueled by growing skepticism about the domino theory and the government's optimistic assessments of the war. Television and the living room war. One of the key factors that galvanized the anti-war movement was the unprecedented role of television in bringing the realities of war into American homes. The Vietnam War is often called the first living room war because of the extensive media coverage it received. News broadcasts showed graphic footage of combat, villages being bombed, and wounded soldiers and civilians. These images painted a stark contrast to the government's assurances of progress, leading many Americans to question the morality and purpose of the war. Television also brought home the human cost of the conflict, particularly as the number of American casualties grew. By 1968, the U.S. death toll had reached over 30,000, and this number continued to climb in the following years. The war's impact was felt deeply across the country, especially among working-class families whose sons were more likely to be drafted and sent to Vietnam. The draft and its role in the movement. The draft was one of the most controversial aspects of the Vietnam War and a major driver of anti-war sentiment. The selective service system required young men to register for military service, and during the height of the war, the draft lottery determined who would be called to fight. While some were able to avoid the draft through college deferments or other exemptions, many working-class and minority men were disproportionately affected. The draft fueled resentment and led to widespread protests. Draft card burnings became a symbolic act of defiance, with many young men refusing to comply with their draft orders. The slogan, "Hell no, we won't go," became a rallying cry for those who opposed the war. Some fled to Canada or other countries to avoid conscription, while others faced imprisonment for draft evasion. Protests and demonstrations. By the late 1960s, the anti-war movement had grown into a mass phenomenon, with protests and demonstrations occurring across the country. College campuses became hubs of activism, as students organized teach-ins, marches, and sit-ins to express their opposition to the war. The University of California, Berkeley, and other major universities became hotbeds of dissent, with students demanding an end to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. One of the most significant demonstrations was the March on the Pentagon in October 1967, where over 100,000 protesters gathered to demand an end to the war. The event included dramatic scenes, such as protesters attempting to levitate the Pentagon and clashes between demonstrators and military police. The march was a turning point that underscored the growing intensity of anti-war sentiment. The anti-war movement reached a tragic and infamous milestone on May 4, 1970, with the Kent State University shootings. During a protest against the U.S. invasion of Cambodia, National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed students, killing 4 and wounding 9. The incident shocked the nation and intensified opposition to the war, sparking additional protests on campuses across the country. Cultural impact and media influence. The anti-war movement permeated American culture, with artists, musicians, and writers using their platforms to express dissent. Songs like "Blowin' in the Wind" by Bob Dylan, "Fortunate Son" by Creedence Clearwater Revival, and "Give Peace a Chance" by John Lennon became anthems of the movement. These songs resonated with a generation disillusioned by war and eager for change. Filmmakers and journalists also played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. Documentaries like Hearts and Minds, 1974, and photojournalism from the war zone exposed the brutality of the conflict. One of the most iconic images was Nick Ute's photograph of a young girl, Phan Thi Kim Phuc, fleeing a napalm attack, which became a symbol of the war's devastation and the human cost of U.S. military involvement. The anti-war movement created deep divisions within American society. Supporters of the war accused protesters of being unpatriotic and undermining the troops, while activists argued that opposing an unjust war was a moral obligation. President Lyndon B. Johnson and later President Richard Nixon faced increasing pressure to address the demands of the anti-war movement. Nixon's administration sought to suppress dissent through measures like surveillance, infiltration, and the use of law enforcement to break up protests. However, these efforts only deepened the mistrust between the government and the public. The release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 further fueled anti-war sentiment, revealing that the government had misled the public about the war's progress and objectives. The anti-war movement profoundly shaped the course of the Vietnam War and American society. It forced the U.S. government to confront growing public opposition and ultimately contributed to the decision to withdraw troops and seek a negotiated settlement. The movement also had a lasting impact on American political activism, inspiring future protests against war, inequality, and environmental issues. While the Vietnam War left deep scars, the anti-war movement demonstrated the power of collective action and the importance of holding leaders accountable. It remains a symbol of a turbulent era when ordinary citizens challenged the status quo and demanded a more just and peaceful world. The Vietnam War introduced a new and devastating dimension to modern warfare: the widespread use of chemical agents as weapons. These substances, deployed by the United States as part of its strategy to combat guerrilla fighters and deprive them of cover and resources, caused immense environmental destruction and long-lasting human suffering. The legacy of chemical warfare during the Vietnam War remains one of its most controversial and tragic aspects, with repercussions that continue to affect Vietnam and its people today. At the heart of the U.S. chemical warfare program was Agent Orange, a herbicide and defoliant designed to strip Vietnam's dense jungles of vegetation. The U.S. military believed that by destroying the forests, they could expose Viet Cong supply routes, camps, and ambush points. Similarly, the defoliation of crops aimed to starve the Viet Cong and weaken their rural support base. The strategy was part of Operation Ranch Hand, which ran from 1962 to 1971 and involved the aerial spraying of millions of gallons of herbicides over vast swaths of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Agent Orange contained a highly toxic chemical compound called dioxin, which would later be linked to severe health problems and environmental damage. Other herbicides used included Agent White, Agent Blue, and Agent Purple, but Agent Orange became the most infamous due to its widespread application and devastating effects. The scale of chemical warfare in Vietnam was unprecedented. Between 1961 and 1971, U.S. forces sprayed more than 20 million gallons of herbicides over approximately 4.5 million acres of forest and farmland. The spraying was carried out using aircraft, helicopters, and even trucks, with areas along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the Mekong Delta being primary targets. Entire ecosystems were destroyed, as the chemicals killed not only vegetation but also animal life. Forests that once teemed with biodiversity were reduced to barren landscapes. Mangroves along the coasts, crucial for preventing erosion and supporting marine life, were also decimated. This environmental destruction disrupted local economies that relied on agriculture and fishing, leaving many Vietnamese villagers impoverished. The human toll of chemical warfare in Vietnam is incalculable. Agent Orange was not only an environmental weapon, but also a cause of long-term health problems for both the Vietnamese people and U.S. veterans who were exposed to it. The dioxin in Agent Orange is one of the most toxic chemicals known to science, linked to a range of severe health conditions, including cancer such as non-Hodgkin lymphoma and prostate cancer, birth defects, including congenital disabilities in children born to exposed parents, neurological disorders, and developmental delays, chronic illnesses, including diabetes and respiratory problems. For the Vietnamese population, the effects were especially devastating. Thousands of children were born with severe deformities and disabilities, and entire communities suffered from increased rates of disease. These health problems have persisted for generations, as dioxin remains in the environment and continues to affect new populations. U.S. veterans who serve in Vietnam and were exposed to Agent Orange experienced similar health problems. Many reported illnesses such as cancer, skin disorders, and respiratory conditions after returning home. Despite mounting evidence of the link between Agent Orange and these illnesses, the U.S. government was initially reluctant to acknowledge the issue. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that compensation programs and medical assistance for affected veterans were introduced. The Agent Orange Act of 1991 provided benefits for veterans suffering from illnesses linked to exposure, but many argue that these measures came too late for thousands who had already died or faced years of neglect. In addition to herbicides, the U.S. military used napalm, a highly flammable gel, during the Vietnam War. Napalm was dropped from aircraft onto enemy positions, villages, and forests, creating massive firestorms that incinerated everything in their path. Its use was justified as a tactical tool to destroy bunkers, flush out guerrillas, and create psychological terror. However, the human cost was catastrophic. Napalm caused horrific burns and death to countless civilians and combatants, leaving survivors with lifelong physical and emotional scars. Images of napalm's effects, such as the famous photograph of Phan Thi Kim Phuc, a young girl running naked after being severely burned, became iconic symbols of the war's brutality and fueled anti-war sentiment worldwide. The use of chemical weapons during the Vietnam War sparked widespread condemnation from the international community. Critics argue that the U.S.'s reliance on such weapons violated the principles of international humanitarian law, which prohibits the targeting of civilians and the use of weapons that cause unnecessary suffering. The Geneva Protocol of 1925, while not explicitly banning herbicides or napalm, was frequently cited in arguments against their use. The U.S. government defended its actions by claiming that herbicides like Agent Orange were not technically chemical weapons, as they were intended to destroy vegetation rather than harm people. However, this argument did little to quell criticism, particularly as evidence of the long-term health effects became undeniable. The legacy of chemical warfare has left Vietnam grappling with environmental and health challenges that persist to this day. Large areas of the country remain contaminated with dioxin, particularly near former U.S. military bases where herbicides were stored. Efforts to clean up these hotspots have been slow and costly, with organizations like the United Nations and the U.S. government providing funding for decontamination projects. In recent years, initiatives such as the Vietnam-U.S. Comprehensive Partnership have included joint efforts to address the lingering impacts of the war. The U.S. government has allocated millions of dollars for environmental cleanup and medical assistance, though many Vietnamese argue that these efforts fall short of addressing the full scale of the problem. The use of chemical weapons during the Vietnam War stands as one of the most tragic and controversial aspects of the conflict. It demonstrated the devastating consequences of prioritizing military objectives over ethical considerations, highlighted the far-reaching effects of war on civilians, ecosystems, and future generations. The legacy of Agent Orange and napalm serves as a stark reminder of the human and environmental costs of warfare, shaping global debates on the ethics of weaponry and the responsibilities of nations in addressing the consequences of their actions. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had reached a turning point. Mounting casualties, escalating costs, and growing domestic opposition forced the United States to rethink its strategy. President Richard Nixon, who took office in 1969, inherited a deeply unpopular war and sought a way to reduce U.S. involvement while avoiding the perception of defeat. This new approach became known as Vietnamization, a policy aimed at transferring combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. Although Vietnamization marked the beginning of U.S. disengagement, it also exposed the weaknesses of South Vietnam and ultimately failed to achieve its intended goals. The Vietnam War had become a quagmire by the late 1960s. U.S. troop levels peaked at over 540,000 in 1969, and the war had claimed the lives of tens of thousands of American soldiers, with no end in sight. At the same time, the Tet Offensive of 1968 had shaken public confidence in the war effort, despite being a military defeat for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. The stark disconnect between the U.S. government's optimistic rhetoric and the reality on the ground fueled growing anti-war sentiment across the United States. President Nixon's campaign promise to achieve peace with honor resonated with an American public increasingly disillusioned by the war. However, Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, faced the dilemma of how to extricate the U.S. from Vietnam without undermining its credibility as a global superpower. Nixon feared that a hasty withdrawal would embolden communist movements worldwide, damaging U.S. influence during the Cold War. To address these challenges, Nixon introduced the policy of Vietnamization. Vietnamization aimed to reduce the direct involvement of U.S. forces in the Vietnam War by strengthening the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, South Vietnam's military. The policy had two primary components. One, gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops. The United States began to scale back its troop presence, with the first major withdrawal of 25,000 soldiers announced in mid-1969. By the end of Nixon's first term in 1973, most U.S. combat forces had left Vietnam, leaving behind only a small contingent of advisors and logistical support personnel. 2. Strengthening South Vietnamese forces. Vietnamization involved training, equipping, and modernizing the ARVN to enable it to take over combat operations. The U.S. provided advanced weaponry, including tanks, helicopters, and artillery, along with extensive training programs. The goal was to create a self-reliant South Vietnamese military capable of defending the country against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. The Nixon administration framed Vietnamization as a way to empower South Vietnam while honoring America's commitments to its allies. However, the policy was also a response to domestic pressure, as anti-war protests reached unprecedented levels during Nixon's presidency. Vietnamization aimed to reduce the direct involvement of U.S. forces in the Vietnam War by strengthening the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, South Vietnam's military. The policy had two primary components. One, gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops. The United States began to scale back its troop presence, with the first major withdrawal of 25,000 soldiers announced in mid-1969. By the end of Nixon's first term in 1973, most U.S. combat forces had left Vietnam, leaving behind only a small contingent of advisors and logistical support personnel. 2. Strengthening South Vietnamese forces. Vietnamization involved training, equipping, and modernizing the ARVN to enable it to take over combat operations. The U.S. provided advanced weaponry, including tanks, helicopters, and artillery, along with extensive training programs. The goal was to create a self-reliant South Vietnamese military capable of defending the country against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. The Nixon administration framed Vietnamization as a way to empower South Vietnam while honoring America's commitments to its allies. However, the policy was also a response to domestic pressure, as anti-war protests reached unprecedented levels during Nixon's presidency. While Vietnamization allowed the U.S. to reduce its military presence, it faced significant challenges on the ground. One of the most pressing issues was the weakness of the South Vietnamese government. Corruption, nepotism, and inefficiency plagued the administration of Nguyen Van Thieu, the president of South Vietnam. These problems undermined public trust and weakened the government's ability to rally national support against the communists. The ARVN, despite receiving billions of dollars in U.S. aid, struggled to match the determination and discipline of the North Vietnamese Army and VA. Many ARVN soldiers lacked motivation, viewing the war as an American conflict rather than a national struggle. Desertion rates were high, and ARVN units often relied heavily on U.S. air support and logistics during combat operations. Additionally, the North Vietnamese continued to receive substantial support from the Soviet Union and China, enabling them to rebuild and adapt despite heavy U.S. bombing campaigns. The Chi Minh Trail, which ran through Laos and Cambodia, remained a critical lifeline for communist forces, allowing them to sustain their operations in the South. As part of his strategy to weaken North Vietnam, Nixon authorized the expansion of the war into neighboring countries. In 1970, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces launched a major incursion into Cambodia, targeting NVA bases and supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This operation aimed to disrupt communist logistics and buy time for Vietnamization to succeed. However, the Cambodian incursion sparked widespread protests in the United States, including the infamous Kent State shootings, where National Guard troops killed 4 unarmed students during an anti-war demonstration. The escalation into Cambodia, followed by similar operations in Laos, highlighted the contradictions of Vietnamization. While the policy sought to reduce U.S. involvement, these actions expanded the scope of the conflict and drew further criticism from both domestic and international observers. After years of negotiation, a breakthrough came in 1973 with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. This agreement, brokered by Nixon and Kissinger, involved the following key provisions. 1. A ceasefire between North and South Vietnam. 2. The withdrawal of all remaining U.S. troops. 3. The release of American prisoners of war, POWs. 4. A commitment to peaceful reunification talks between North and South Vietnam. While the accords allowed the U.S. to declare an end to its direct involvement in the war, they did little to resolve the underlying conflict between North and South Vietnam. The ceasefire was tenuous, and fighting continued almost immediately after the U.S. withdrawal. The end of the Vietnam War was marked by one of the most dramatic and symbolic moments in modern history, the Fall of Saigon in April 1975. This event not only signified the defeat of the South Vietnamese government, but also brought an end to decades of conflict that had divided Vietnam and consumed the lives of millions. The collapse of Saigon and the final victory of communist forces were the culmination of years of political turmoil, military setbacks, and shifting alliances. It was a moment that defined the legacy of the Vietnam War and its profound impact on the people of Vietnam and the world. After the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, the United States formally withdrew its combat troops from Vietnam. However, the war between North and South Vietnam continued, with the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and the Viet Cong intensifying their efforts to overthrow the South Vietnamese government. Despite promises of ongoing U.S. financial and military aid, South Vietnam faced significant challenges, including dwindling resources, low morale, and widespread corruption. In early 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive known as the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, aimed at capturing Saigon and reunifying Vietnam under communist rule. This campaign was characterized by a series of rapid and decisive attacks on key cities and provinces in South Vietnam. The fall of Ban Mi Thuot in March 1975 was a turning point, as it exposed the vulnerabilities of the South Vietnamese military and triggered a chain reaction of retreats and surrenders. The South Vietnamese government, led by President Nguyen Van Thieu, struggled to mount an effective defense. As the North Vietnamese advanced, Thieu ordered a strategic withdrawal from the Central Highlands, hoping to consolidate forces in more defensible areas. However, this retreat quickly turned into a chaotic rout, with soldiers abandoning their posts and civilians fleeing in panic. The resulting collapse of South Vietnamese defenses allowed the NVA to move swiftly towards Saigon. As the North Vietnamese forces closed in on Saigon, the city descended into chaos. Tens of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians, government officials, and military personnel feared retribution from the communists and sought to escape the city. The streets were filled with desperate people trying to board planes, ships, or any available transportation to flee the country. The U.S. Embassy became a focal point of this desperation, as thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked with or for the Americans hoped to be evacuated. The situation was further complicated by the U.S. government's decision to limit the scope of its evacuation efforts. While the United States had already withdrawn its combat forces, it maintained a small diplomatic and military presence in Saigon. As the fall of the city became imminent, President Gerald Ford authorized Operation Frequent Wind, the final phase of the evacuation effort. Helicopters ferried U.S. personnel, their families, and a limited number of South Vietnamese allies to ships waiting off the coast. The iconic image of the evacuation, a helicopter perched atop a building, with a line of people scrambling to board, has become a symbol of the chaotic and desperate end of the Vietnam War. For many, it represented the failure of U.S. policy in Vietnam and the abandonment of those who had supported the American cause. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, marking the official end of the war. The South Vietnamese government had effectively ceased to function, with President Thieu resigning and fleeing the country days earlier. His successor, General Duong Van Minh, attempted to negotiate a surrender, but the North Vietnamese refused to engage in talks, insisting on an unconditional victory. As North Vietnamese forces entered the city, they encountered little resistance. The iconic moment of the fall came when a North Vietnamese tank crashed through the gates of the presidential palace, symbolizing the collapse of the South Vietnamese regime. The Viet Cong flag was raised over the palace, signaling the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. For many South Vietnamese, the fall of Saigon was a moment of profound loss and uncertainty. Families were torn apart as some fled the country while others stayed behind, unsure of what the future will hold. The city's streets, once bustling with life, were now filled with fear and resignation as communist troops took control. In the months and years following the fall of Saigon, millions of South Vietnamese fled the country, fearing persecution and reprisals from the new regime. This mass exodus became one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century. Many fled by sea in overcrowded and poorly equipped boats, earning them the name boat people. The journey was fraught with danger, as refugees faced storms, starvation, and attacks by pirates. Thousands perished at sea, while others endured years in refugee camps before being resettled in countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and France. The plight of the boat people drew international attention and underscored the human cost of the Vietnam War. Following the fall of Saigon, Vietnam was officially reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in July 1976, with its capital in Hanoi. The new government, led by the Communist Party, faced the monumental task of rebuilding a nation devastated by decades of war. The economy was in ruins, and millions of people were displaced or struggling to survive. The communist regime implemented sweeping changes, including the collectivization of agriculture and the nationalization of industries. These policies, combined with the economic damage caused by the war, led to widespread poverty and food shortages. The government also sought to consolidate its control by re-educating former South Vietnamese officials, soldiers, and intellectuals in camps, where many faced harsh conditions and long-term imprisonment. Despite these challenges, the Vietnamese government worked to assert its sovereignty and rebuild its infrastructure. In the 1980s, the country began implementing economic reforms known as Doi Moi, which shifted the economy toward market-oriented policies and spurred growth. The Fall of Saigon remains one of the most poignant symbols of the Vietnam War and its aftermath. For the United States, it represented the culmination of a long and costly conflict that failed to achieve its objectives. The war had left deep scars on American society, from the loss of over 58,000 U.S. soldiers to the social and political divisions it created at home. For Vietnam, the Fall of Saigon marked the end of a struggle for national reunification, but also the beginning of a difficult journey toward recovery and reconciliation. The war's legacy continues to shape Vietnam's identity and its relations with the world, as the country seeks to balance its revolutionary history with its aspirations for economic growth and modernization. The Vietnam War, which officially ended with the Fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, left an enduring legacy that shaped Vietnam, the United States, and the global community in profound ways. The war's aftermath was marked by political, social, and economic transformations that continue to resonate today. From the devastating human cost to its influence on geopolitics, the Vietnam War remains a pivotal chapter in modern history. The Vietnam War was one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century, leaving a profound toll on both combatants and civilians. Estimates suggest that over 3 million Vietnamese died during the war, including soldiers and civilians from both North and South Vietnam. Many of these deaths resulted from bombing campaigns, chemical warfare, and the widespread destruction of villages and infrastructure. Additionally, millions of people were injured, displaced, or left homeless by the war's violence. For the United States, the war claimed the lives of over 58,000 American soldiers, while another 300,000 were wounded. Many veterans returned home physically and emotionally scarred, grappling with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, substance abuse, and difficulty reintegrating into civilian life. The war's psychological toll on veterans and their families became a central aspect of its legacy, sparking debates about the treatment and support of returning soldiers. Beyond the immediate loss of life, the war left long-term consequences for survivors. In Vietnam, unexploded ordnance, UXO, such as landmines and cluster bombs, continues to pose a threat to civilians decades after the war's end. Similarly, the widespread use of Agent Orange and other defoliants has led to severe health problems, including birth defects and cancers, affecting multiple generations of Vietnamese families. The reunification of Vietnam under communist rule in 1975 marked the end of decades of conflict, but also ushered in a period of significant challenges. The newly formed Socialist Republic of Vietnam, led by the Communist Party, faced the daunting task of rebuilding a war-torn nation. The country's infrastructure was in ruins, its economy was devastated, and millions of people were displaced. The communist government implemented sweeping economic reforms, including the collectivization of agriculture and the nationalization of industries. However, these policies initially led to widespread poverty, food shortages, and economic stagnation. Many South Vietnamese who had been associated with the former regime were sent to re-education camps, where they faced harsh conditions, forced labor, and extended periods of incarceration. In the late 1980s, the Vietnamese government introduced a series of economic reforms known as Doi Moi renovation, which marked a shift from a centrally planned economy to a market-oriented one. These reforms spurred economic growth, reduced poverty, and opened Vietnam to foreign investment and trade. Today, Vietnam is one of the fastest-growing economies in Southeast Asia, but the scars of the war remain evident in its landscapes, its people, and its collective memory. For the United States, the Vietnam War had a profound and lasting impact on its society, politics, and military policies. The war exposed deep divisions within American society, particularly between those who supported the conflict and those who opposed it. The anti-war movement became a defining feature of the era, with protests, civil disobedience, and cultural dissent challenging the government's actions and shaping public opinion. The war also led to a crisis of confidence in U.S. leadership. The revelations of government deception, such as those exposed in the Pentagon Papers, eroded trust in the political establishment and fueled skepticism about future military interventions. The term Vietnam Syndrome was coined to describe the reluctance of American leaders and the public to engage in prolonged foreign conflicts after the trauma of Vietnam. From a military perspective, the Vietnam War forced the United States to reevaluate its strategies and objectives in warfare. The conflict highlighted the limitations of superior firepower and technology in achieving political goals, particularly in asymmetric wars against determined insurgencies. These lessons influenced U.S. military doctrine in subsequent conflicts, such as those in Iraq and Afghanistan, emphasizing the importance of understanding local cultures, politics, and the challenges of counterinsurgency. The Fall of Saigon and the subsequent reunification of Vietnam triggered one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century. Over 1 million South Vietnamese fled the country, fearing persecution under the communist government. Many of these refugees became known as boat people, undertaking perilous journeys across the sea in overcrowded and unsafe vessels to escape Vietnam. The refugee crisis led to the establishment of international resettlement programs, with countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and France providing sanctuary to Vietnamese refugees. The United States alone admitted over 800,000 Vietnamese refugees, who became part of a vibrant diaspora community that has enriched American culture while also preserving the memory of the war and its consequences. The Vietnam War had far-reaching implications for global geopolitics. For the United States, the war was a stark reminder of the limits of its power during the Cold War, as it failed to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The conflict also strained U.S. alliances, as many of its allies questioned the wisdom and morality of American intervention in Vietnam. For Vietnam, the end of the war marked a shift in its relationships with other nations. Initially isolated by Western countries, Vietnam relied heavily on support from the Soviet Union and other communist allies. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s forced Vietnam to seek new partnerships, leading to improved relations with the United States and its neighbors in Southeast Asia. The normalization of U.S.-Vietnam relations in 1995, marked by the re-establishment of diplomatic ties, was a significant milestone. Today, Vietnam and the United States maintain a cooperative relationship, driven by shared economic interests and mutual concerns about regional security. The Vietnam War has left a lasting cultural and historical legacy, inspiring countless books, films, and artistic works that grapple with its complexities. Movies like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and The Deer Hunter have explored the psychological and moral dimensions of the war, while memoirs and novels by Vietnamese and American authors have provided personal insights into the conflict's human cost. The war also shaped how conflicts are reported and perceived. The extensive media coverage of Vietnam, including graphic images and on-the-ground reporting, set a precedent for how modern wars are documented. The role of journalists in exposing the realities of the war has become a key part of its legacy, influencing both public opinion and policy debates in future conflicts.